Right, we'll get started. Right, we'll get started. Right, your lecture 2 is on the first standard, professionalism. I hope you have read the notes. Right, so professionalism is on 1A and 1B. Do you find it a bit noisy here because my next door is doing some renovation? I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me properly? Right, good. Right, so as I've said in the previous lecture, standard 1 right? Standard 1. Okay, I'm talking about standard 1 here, right? It sets out the minimum level of conduct. Okay, standard 1 is minimum level of conduct, right? So that's why standard 1 is actually quite broad in scope. Okay, now 2 to 7. Now you are not doing 7 actually. You're 2 to 6 actually, right? 2 to 6. Standards 2 to 6 are more focused, right? And basically address specific topics that are critical to the integrity of the investment business. Right. Now, do you find it noisy? Because my next door is doing some renovation and they're doing some drilling. I hope you can hear me. Right, so basically 1A, right? Right, you must be able to understand and comply with all the applicable laws, rules, and regulations. Right, so law is the highest, right? Rules and regulations are secondary. Okay, so laws should be even stricter, right? So we are talking about laws, rules, and regulations of any government, regulatory organization, right? Any licensing agency or any professional association governing your professional activities. Right? So this is what knowledge of the law is about here. Right. So now between the laws, rules, and regulations, right, there will be some conflict. Right, so in the event of any conflict, right, you must what should you do? You must comply with the stricter version, right? Stricter of either the law, rule, or regulation, right? Right. Usually, laws are stricter, right? So, but it's hard to say. Sometimes the rules and regulation can be stricter than the law, right? Okay. Right. So since you know the law, if you know that if it infringed the law, rule, or regulation, right? If you know that it violated either one of these, right? You must not knowingly participate, right? Participate or assist, right? In these activities. Okay, that's the first point. And you must dissociate. Right, you must dissociate. That means not get involved, right, from any of this violation of such laws, rules, and regulations. Okay. So, I mean, basically, you must have an understanding, right, of all the laws, regulations, of all the countries in which you work, right? Because different countries, right, have got different laws and regulations. Okay, so you must have a basic understanding. Now, you are supposed to just have an understanding, right? Not required to be an expert. You are not supposed to be an expert in compliance, or have detailed knowledge and expertise. You're not, you're not supposed to be like a lawyer, right? So you're supposed to just have an understanding. Okay, that is why it's called knowledge of the law, right? Knowledge of the law. All right, so you must understand, and then you must comply, right? You must comply with all the laws and regulations that directly govern your investment activities. Okay, so we are focusing on basically anything that governs your investment activities. Right? So basically, right, it seems like common sense, right? Right? You should follow the law, right? However, when applied to international situations, right? Right? Because international situations, right, some laws can be stricter or less strict, right? So regardless of whether it is a law, rule, or regulation, right, you must follow the stricter version. All right? You just remember you must follow the stricter version. Right? So now you can see the law, the code and standards, right? These code and standards will represent the rules and regulations, right? So the law, I mean, sometimes these two may require different conduct. Okay, so I mean, as I said earlier, right, you must follow the stricter version. Okay, why? Because if you follow the stricter version, right, this would afford greater protection for the investor. Okay, that's the rationale behind following the stricter version. All right, the stricter of the applicable law or code. Right. Right. So strict adherence to following principles. Right. So basically, you must comply with the applicable law or regulation. All right. You must not violate the code and standards, even though it is legal. Right. So I mean that means your code and standards is the minimum. Right. It's the minimum standard. So even though it's legal, you still must not violate the code and standards. All right. Second point. So if so in the absence, right, of any applicable law or regulation, or when the code and standards impose a higher degree of responsibility than the applicable laws and regulations, right? As I've said, sometimes the code and standards can be higher than the laws or the country's regulation, right? So as a minimum, right, you must adhere to the code and standards, right? So the code and standards is the minimum, right? The minimum standards. Right. So with regards to deem participation or association with violations by others, right? Especially if you're working in a group, right? You must dissociate from any imminent or ongoing illegal or unethical activities, right? So the onus on you is to dissociate. You must dissociate. How? Right? Now, this is whistleblowing. You can do whistleblowing. That means you report, you report on the misbehavior, right? Or you report on the illegal or unethical activity, right? The other option is confrontation. You warn the other party that it is, you're in violation, all right? Now, if you cannot solve through whistleblowing or confrontation, right, you dissociate. Okay. Right. So if you don't do this, either one of these, right? If you don't do either one of these, right, this is deemed to be inaction, right? And it may be deemed continuing association, right? That means this may be construed as participation or assistance in illegal or unethical conduct. All right. So basically, you should do this too. Right. Now you ask the question, do we need to report the violation to the regulatory body? Right. So now, if you talk about reporting, right, reporting the violation, right? Now, this is actually not mandatory by regulation. The regulation doesn't state you must report, but it is prudent to do so. All right. It is sensible to do so. Okay. However, right, if it's required by the applicable law, then it's mandated. That means it's compulsory. Okay, now when you do a report, right, obviously you don't do an oral report. Okay, you submit a written complaint. It should be written. All right, it should be written. Right, so now please pay attention now to what I'm saying now. Right, so if you notice, right, in all your lectures from now onwards, right, you will have this section on, say, recommended procedures for compliance. Okay, now these are just some of the suggestions, right? Because say in your exam question, right, you'll be basically tested on the concepts, right? On the concepts of the values, right? The concepts, right? Your ability to dissect the cases, because the code and standards will be applied to the cases. And if you're asked for suggestions, right? Suggestions as to how to improve on the situation, right? You'll be asked for suggestions, all right? Then these recommended procedures throughout your lectures, right, could serve as a guide, to you to use for suggestions, right? Obviously, you don't copy word for word, but these are just some of the ideas, as to how to improve the situation, right? So I hope that's clear, right? So basically, these are just some suggestions, right? So recommended procedures for compliance, so that you don't violate, right? So basically, what should they be doing? The protagonists, right? They should stay informed about any changes in the laws, right? Stay informed, right? Through memos or CBDs, right? CBDs are continuing professional development, right? After you graduate, right, you'll probably be engaged in some continuing professional development. All right, you still have to need to attend some courses. So basically, suggestions, right? Stay informed, because we are talking about knowledge of law, right? So you got to stay informed. All right. Then second point, review procedures to ensure that whatever knowledge you have are current, right? And that your, I mean, all these trainings, right? All these memos and PDs, right? They provide adequate guidance, right? Okay, all these memos and CBDs, right? They provide adequate guidance. Third point is you maintain current files, right? Current files, up to date, right? On all applicable statutes, right? Statutes refers to laws, right? Rules, regulations, and important cases, right? So these cases, basically would act as precedents for any violations and how they are handled. Okay. Then the fourth suggestion is, the term distribution area laws, right? Basically, that means you must understand the law in that area that you are servicing, that you're working in. Distribution area laws, right? This term sounds a bit weird, right? But I mean, this is the word given, right? It sounds a bit weird. Distribution area laws. So basically, it just means that you must make every effort to understand the laws of the country or region in which they operate. Okay, including those where their products or services are distributed across borders. Okay. Right. So now, as to whether a conduct, five, right? As to whether a conduct is legal or illegal, right? Sometimes it could be ambiguous. That means we are not clear, right? It could be ambiguous, right? Because certain conduct may not, in fact, be a violation. It may not be. You may think it is, but it may not be. So that's why you need to consult counsel, right? Consult the lawyer. Right. So another suggestion, right, is dissociate. All right. Dissociate, disassociate, right? It's the same thing. Dissociate or disassociate. It means the same thing. From any illegal activity or actively urge a firm. All right. So that's why, I mean, if you actively urge, this is a sort of a confrontation, as I've spoken earlier, right? Urge them to cease the conduct. Don't do it. Okay. So you must do something. You must do something. So as I said, inaction may be judged, right, as participating or assisting. Right. So if you do nothing, you still violate the standard. Is that clear? Right. So those are the recommended procedures for compliance for individuals, right? The previous two slides, right? So now is for firms, right? Okay. So for the firm itself, you see, the firm is an entity. Individuals are, well, or individuals, right? So the firm is considered an entity, right? So basically, the firm should develop or adopt a code of ethics, right? Okay, a separate code of ethics. It may be similar to the code of ethics we are talking about here, but they must develop a code of ethics, right? And make sure that all the employees know about all the laws and regulations, right? And all, I mean, the material concerning the laws and regulations are made available to or distributed to all the employees, right? Okay, then the third point is you establish written protocol, right? That means SOP. It's like an SOP, right? Like an SOP, standard operating procedure, right? SOP, standard operating procedure, for reporting suspected violations of laws, regulations, or company policies, right? There must be step by step as to how to report, right, all these suspected violations. Okay. Right. So now, we talk about the global application of the code and standards, right? Right. So now this global practice, right? I mean, as investment professionals, you can practice anywhere in the world, right? So you're subject to multiple jurisdictions, right? When you talk about multiple jurisdictions, right, you are subject to varied security laws, right? So we are not just talking about laws, but we're talking about securities law. Securities, that means investment securities, right? And regulations, right? These are usually by the professional association in that country, okay? So because you're exposed to multiple jurisdictions, right? So there are different versions, right? So basically you must always adhere to the stricter, right, of whatever laws, code, or standards, right? So you must always adhere to whichever is stricter. Okay, that's a very basic point. Right. So basically, we are trying to categorize the versions, right? So basically, we just generalize into three types, right? Three types of countries, right? NSL basically stands for no securities law, right? No securities law, NSL. I mean, maybe these countries are not very developed right now, not very developed, right? Like in Africa, right? So this is one basic type, no securities law. Second is less strict, right? LS, right? Basically stands for less strict, right? Less strict security laws and regulations than the code and standards. So they are lower than the code and standards. The third one is more strict, right? More strict, MS, right? More strict, less strict. So this more strict, that means they have laws and regulations that are stricter than the code and standards, right? That are stricter than the code and standards. All right. So basically, we have three types of countries, right? NSL, LS, and MS. All right. Right. So here, basically, we are talking about the applicable law in that particular country, right? And what you should do. And this is the justification for your duties. Okay. So basically, if you reside, you're from a NSL country, no securities, law, NSL, and you do business in a less strict country. Okay, so now this less strict is higher than this, right? Higher than not NSL, right? So you use the stricter version, so the less strict law applies. Right. So basically, as I've said, this is the minimum, right? The code and standards is the minimum, right? You must always adhere to the code and standards. Justification, because the applicable law is less strict than the code and standards, right? The member must adhere to the code and standards, right? Because the code and standards is the lowest, is the minimum. Okay. Now, if you reside in an NSL country and you do business in a more strict country, obviously the more strict law applies, right? So you must adhere to the law of the more strict country. Justification is because the applicable law is stricter than the code and standards. So you must adhere to the more strict applicable law, right? So this is actually very straightforward, right? Another example, if you reside in a less strict country, you do business in no securities law country, so you always go higher, so the less strict law applies, right? So less strict law. So here, basically, you must adhere to the minimum code and standards. Justification, because the applicable law is less strict than the code and standards, you must adhere to the code and standards, because the code and standards is the minimum level of conduct, level that you should adhere to. All right. Right. So all these are basically the same thing, right? Right. Depending on the applicable law, right? So if you reside in a more strict country, you do business in a less strict country, you still adhere to the higher version, right? Okay. So applicable law is stricter than the code and standard. So you must adhere to the more strict applicable law. All right. So here again, same thing. Member resides in more strict country, does business in less strict country. So more strict law applies. Right. But it states that the law of the locality where the business is conducted governs. Okay. So this is a bit strange, right? You come from a more strict country and you do business in a less strict country. Okay. The law says that the locality where the business is conducted governs. So this implies that this law here, right, is lower than the code and standards. But your duty is to adhere to the code and standards. So regardless of whether it is higher or lower, the minimum, right, is the code and standards. Okay. All right. So explanation here, because the applicable law states that the law of the locality where the business is conducted governs, and local law is less strict than the code and standards, right? You must adhere to the code and standards because the code and standards are the minimum. Okay, so this example here, member resides in more strict country, does business in less strict country with a client who is a citizen of a less strict country. More strict law applies, but it states that the law of the client's home country governs. Client of the home country governs. Right? That means here again it implies that it is lower than the code and standards, but you must adhere to the code and standards. Justification, because the applicable law states that the law of the client's home country governs, which is less strict, right? See, here is less strict than the code and standards, right? So as I've said, the member must adhere to the code and standards as a minimum, right? So regardless of whatever version, right, you must adhere to the code and standards. Last example, right? Member resides in more strict country, does business in less strict country with a client who is a citizen of the more strict country. The more strict law applies, but it states that the law of the client's home country governs. All right. So here again, right, you must go higher. So here you must adhere to the law of the more strict country. Explanation, because the applicable law states that the law of the client's home country governs. Right? Law of the client's home country governs. But he does business in the less strict country. Right? So you come from a more strict country, right? You must always go higher. All right, here it says because the applicable law states that the law of the client's home country governs, but this law here is less strict. Okay, and the law of the client's home country, right, is stricter than the code and standards. Right, law of the client's home country is stricter than the code and standards. So you must adhere to the more strict applicable law. Right, so this is the explanation, and this is what you should be doing. Okay. Any question? Right, so now we do some case studies, right? So now, these are just some examples of very simple cases, just to illustrate, you know, the standards. Very simple, right? So here, Alan works for a brokerage firm and is responsible for an underwriting of securities. A company official gives Alan information indicating that the financial statements Alan filed with the regulator overstated, right, the issuer's earning. Okay, so Alan seeks the advice of the brokerage firm's general counsel, who states that it will be difficult for the regulator to prove. Now, even though it's difficult for the regulator to prove, right, you still must owe up, right? Right. So here is about knowledge of the law. Right. So here, now, Alan has sought legal advice, but you should, I mean, even though your lawyer tell you that it's difficult for the regulators to prove, right? He should not just listen to the legal advice. Okay. Right. So the reliance on such advice does not absolve him from requirement to comply with the law. So the issue is about compliance with the law and regulation. So what he should be doing, right? He should report, right, this situation to the supervisor. Okay, and then maybe and also seek an independent legal opinion. Okay, not just the legal opinion of the legal counsel in his firm, and then determine whether the regulator should be notified of the error. So this is proper behavior. This is proper conduct. Okay, so this is about notification of known violation, right? So or there could be a violation. So this is a question mark, right? You're not sure. So that's why you must seek an independent legal opinion, right? You must seek an independent legal opinion. And then you determine whether the regulator should be notified. Okay, should be notified. All right. So this is about notification of known violations. Is that clear? Right. Second case, Lawrence employer, an investment banking firm, is the principal underwriter for an issue of convertible debentures by one of his clients, Courtney Corporation. Lawrence discovered that Courtney Corporation has concealed severe third quarter losses, right, in its foreign operations. Right. So this concealment, right, is a violation. Okay. Now the preliminary prospectus has already been distributed. Right. So basically, this prospectus, right, is misleading. So he should report. Right. He should report. Okay. He know that it is misleading. Okay. And so he should report the findings to whoever, right? And if the matter is not remedied, if not remedied, right, and his employer does not dissociate from the underwriting, okay, then Lawrence, right, as an individual, should sever all his connections, right, with the underwriting, and he should also seek legal advice to determine whether additional reporting or other action should be taken, right? So this whole thing is about dissociating from a violation. Okay, is that clear? If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Right, case 3, Commissioner's firm advertises its past 10-year record by showing the 10-year return of a composite of its client's account. However, Commissioner discovers that the composite omits, right? So there's some misrepresentation here, omits the performance of the accounts that have left the firm during the 10-year period, and that this omission has led to an inflated performance figure. Commissioner is instructed to use promotional material that includes the erroneous performance